Hello everyone and welcome to the CSGO update. My name is Protalis and I am here to break down some of the week's biggest news stories and roster moves in Counter-Strike for you. And I'm sure you're all aware we had a major bombshell get dropped on us in the CSGO scene this week. So without further ado, let's take a look at the biggest news story to hit CSGO so far in 2021. Cloud9, one of the world's leading esports organizations, has declared its departure from the CSGO esports scene. This story was initially broken by Nell as a rumor and then confirmed by Ryan over at Rushby Media, who managed to speak to Jack Etienne and officially confirm the story. In the Rushby article, Etienne cites the COVID-19 pandemic as the primary source of concern for the roster, stating that issues, for example, with Alex not being able to return to his home country of France, preventing them from relocating the team to Los Angeles and developing a cohesive training structure there. This article was also very clear to state, as was Jack Etienne within it, that Cloud9 are only temporarily leaving the Counter-Strike esports space and have plans to return after they have assessed the viability of the scene and determined that a profitable venture can be made from their return to the space. But there are some troubling signs in the CSGO ecosystem that this actually could be the end for Cloud9 in CSGO esports on a permanent basis. Shortly after Cloud9 made the announcement that they would be withdrawing from CSGO esports, veteran journalist Richard Lewis went on his live stream to give live opinions on the matter. He stated he believes that Cloud9's departure from the CSGO space will be permanent, as they are the latest in a string of North American organizations to depart the scene and head for what they perceive to be the greener pastures of Valorant. Lewis goes on within this live stream to say that the North American Counter-Strike market is essentially as good as dead, and even hinted at the fact that the esports organization Evil Geniuses could be looking at an exit from Counter-Strike as well in the near future, which would leave just Team Liquid as essentially your only Tier 1 North American team left in the CSGO esports scene. Lewis stated in his live stream that a large reason for this is the state of the North American esports market in a COVID-19 pandemic that's already seeing sponsorship budgets shrink on the whole, and a political landscape which makes sponsoring a game involving terrorists and assault weapons apparently a brand risk to certain companies in America. You can easily see why sponsorship is perhaps turning to that smaller, growing Valorant scene that doesn't need as much upfront sponsorship investment to get involved in, and is essentially a cartoon game with cartoon violence, which to the sensibilities of American sponsors and shareholders seems to create a more brand-friendly environment in the esports space for sponsors in Valorant compared to within CSGO. Finally, Richard stated that the future of the CSGO esports scene is that it's likely going to be propped up by the European and Brazilian fan bases and teams, essentially, and he drew parallels between what's currently happening in CSGO and the decline of CS Source in the early 2010s, which is Richard Lewis is probably one of the only people who has been about throughout both scenes in their entirety. So if anyone's going to have some insight on to how similar the decline of CS could be now compared to how it declined in the early 2010s, it would definitely be him. Now, if there's one thing I also know about history, it is that those who do not learn it are doomed to repeat it. And something in the back of my mind tells me that there are plenty of people in key decision-making positions in esports organizations that do not have the tenure and the history to see these different esports scenes come to life and then fade away. And perhaps more importantly, if there are not people in positions of power who have been through an esports decline before, how are they going to successfully mitigate that decline in the present? So in reaction to this story, I can understand why a lot of the newer esports fans might not think it's such a big deal that Cloud9 are leaving the CSGO space, especially if you only got into Counter-Strike after that Boston major. You essentially watched their American team go into decline and then all-out free fall. You then watch the Cloud9 organization spend a couple of years just trying to save money, building these various European mixes, and then signing that South African roster, which is now known as Extra Salt, before they took a decision to then build what was dubbed as the Colossus, but ultimately never lived up to some of the insane price tags that were being thrown around in the early days of the announcement of this roster. Cloud9 are considered an industry leader by many other key decision makers in the esports space. The fact that Cloud9 have no longer determined that CSGO is worthy of their time investment just 6 months after saying that the game would always be part of their DNA is incredibly dangerous for investor and business confidence in the CSGO esports space. And we all know there are plenty of people trying to get involved in esports who just have no idea what it is. So seeing a story like this, Cloud9 ditching the scene apropos of nothing seemingly, it's incredibly dangerous for investor confidence. And that danger is only exacerbated when you consider that 2020 was an insane year from Cloud9 in terms of the amount of money they invested into the roster. Not only did they have to pay buyouts for some of the players like Esatag and Mezzi that they picked up for the roster, but they also announced these multi-year, in some case, multi-million-dollar contracts that were being signed. Let's also not forget that they spent $2 million to buy in as a founding partner of the Flashpoint League. So Cloud9's investment into CSGO in the 2020 year could be somewhere in the tens of millions of US dollars, and just 3 months into 2021, they're deciding to ditch the scene entirely before they can even attempt to recuperate some of that investment. It is a very worrying sign in terms of optics for the game, and considering that LANs are supposed to be coming back at the end of this year, which is when the Cloud9 roster theoretically should start to see its real gain in terms of those global rankings. Cloud9 deciding that it's not worth even to wait another 3 months until that summer period is just terrible optics for the CSGO investment space, to say the least. Now, we did mention Flashpoint briefly just then, but of course Cloud9's exit from the CSGO space is another crippling blow to what some consider to be the only real competitor to the ESL Pro League model at the beginning of the last year. If you can cast your minds back to the industry narrative that was established by community members and certain news outlets, it was very much a Flashpoint versus EPL war almost, and a battle to see which tournament organizer was going to come out on top in the CSGO space. Well, Cloud9 are now the fourth partnered team with the Flashpoint League to not have an active CSGO roster alongside Contact, Envy, and Gen G. That means now that 4 out of 7 of the founding partner teams for Flashpoint, the majority of the league, do not even have CSGO rosters assigned to the organization. It beggars belief, in my opinion. Why on earth would you want to spend $2 million buying into a Counter-Strike project if you can't even be bothered to have a team on the books? Flashpoint, it does not look like it's going to be able to be the revolutionary project that they wanted to make CSGO esports sustainable. And I have to say that is another very worrying sign for the CSGO scene in general. A major esports organization and a major tournament organizer who were seeking sustainability within the CSGO ecosystem. Now, C9 team has departed the CSGO space completely, and it's pretty obvious from the way that Flashpoint is likely going to be running its events going forward that it can be nothing like the project it initially set out to be. You've heard ex-creative director Duncan Thorin Shield hour-long video talking about why he left the Flashpoint project in general, and it's a real shame, honestly, to see Flashpoint start to fall by the wayside in that regard, because I personally felt that the tournament project had the superior broadcast product. It just needed to get those better teams there to improve the quality of the games, and then I really think Flashpoint could have been in position to have perhaps challenged the spot for most dominant tournament organizer in the CSGO space. But it's safe to say that when the majority of your partnered teams aren't even technically teams, you can't even call them that at this point, what actually is your franchised league tournament? So let's talk about some of the players, of course, from the C9 organization who are the other stakeholder who are affected by this story. There's no news as of yet as to any specifics behind any of their plans going forward in the CSGO esports scene. Cloud9 have stated that Henry G has acted professionally throughout all of this scenario, and that they could potentially see a world where they keep him on in an esports managerial capacity. But Henry G strikes me as a person who actually has Counter-Strike in their DNA, is not someone who just says they are and then leaves the scene 6 months later. So I would be personally quite surprised to see Henry G leave CSGO and get involved in esports management in a different scene. Just in terms of his history with the game and his tenure as a player, I just see him being involved in the CSGO space in some capacity moving forward. As far as the players for the Cloud9 organization are concerned, they are all free to explore other options. That's the official line from Cloud9 following their benching from the official roster. Now, Richard Lewis said in his reaction live stream that he believes the most likely paths forward for Floppy and Zeppa are to head into that Valorant space, especially for Zeppa, because he has the potential to reunite with some of his ex-Chaos Esports Club teammates. In terms of players like Ali and Esatag, they are most likely to have options in both Valorant and CSGO as English-speaking players in general. I think Alex probably has the most stock in the CSGO space as an English-speaking IGL. There tends to always be a demand for a player like that in the current market, and especially if you take a look over at that G2 camp, who are struggling compared to the number one spot that they were pushing at some spots in 2020. Perhaps a fresh look at in-game leadership on that roster with somebody who can speak both English and French for their English and French speaking mix that they have with Nico Hunter and some of the French players on that roster. Then who knows, maybe he could be a decent fit in that organization, but that's just theory crafting at this point. Esatag, I'm sure, would have options from various European mixes. We know that OG are in the mix looking for new players, whilst they're not necessarily seeking firepower at the moment. There are definitely potential options out there for him, but the players you have to feel, or the player I feel the most sorry for in this story, is Mezzy. He's someone who was essentially scouted by Henry G out of that ESEA Premier Mountain Dew League scene, essentially plucked from Tier 2 and then proved that he can function within Tier 1 and perform very effectively as a role player, it does have to be said. Now, he essentially is just cut and dry from this project. And unfortunately for Mezzy, generally speaking, unfortunately, British CSGO players do not hold the most stock out of anyone in the current esports scene. To wrap this story up, though, guys, I think that Cloud9 leaving the esport is a seriously bad sign for the health of the CSGO ecosystem. We'll have to see what happens with the Evil Geniuses organization, but if Richard Lewis is to be believed, and he has not yet lied publicly in the CSGO space, then they could be the next big NA organization to leave Counter-Strike, and I do believe that if Evil Geniuses decide to quit and head for the hills of Valorant, then North American Counter-Strike would pretty much be relegated to a Tier 2 scene at that point. You know that Team Liquid are based in training facilities in Europe pretty much permanently at the moment, and due to the state of international travel, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to manage these huge transatlantic lands between Europe and the North American continent. So all in all, it looks like there are some tough times for CSGO ahead. That much is for sure, especially if you are a North American Counter-Strike fan. We'll just have to hope that there are some savvy investors in esports out there who perhaps would be willing to step into the gaps. It's worrying times for CSGO ahead, to be sure. I'm hoping that CS has a few more years left in it as a European and Brazilian esport, to be sure, but when I look back and I see the global dominant position that CSGO was in back in 2016, 17, 18, 2019 definitely started to begin a decline, in my opinion, and now I personally am worried that the golden years of CSGO as a truly dominant global esport have now come to an end. So that was the main news from this week, guys. I know it was pretty heavy stuff, and we didn't exactly finish on an optimistic note for the CSGO esports space, but there are still competitions going on, and competitions need teams, and when teams are involved, there are going to be roster moves and announcements all over the place. So let's take a look at some of the most notable roster action coming out of the last week of CSGO esports. So our first roster announcement of the week comes from the Mad Lions camp. We spoke about them a little bit last week when they signed Kjaerbye as a coach for the organization. We also announced in that video that he would be responsible for leading a new European mix of players, and last Tuesday we had the formal announcement from Mad Lions as to what that roster is going to look like. It will be comprised of the likes of TMB, Tudson, Waro2K, Keen, JL, and Sorsen, who will comprise the six-man squad for the organization. Bit of an interesting decision for Mad Lions to bring forward a six-man roster when you're seeing the likes of Vitality and Team One start to shed their additional players in light of the new substitution penalties that Valve are bringing forward for the upcoming RMR events. And additionally, when you take a look at some of the names signed by this roster, they don't exactly strike you as tier 1 talent. So I think it's going to be pretty difficult for Mad Lions to push the top 30 with this roster, especially when you consider that there are organizations like Fnatic lurking down there at the rank number 27 mark. Our next announcement comes out of the Danish scene, and this is another story broken by Nell over at 1.pv. Kjaerbye is returning to the CSGO scene alongside some familiar names from the Danish scene if you are a fan of that country's national esports environment. Kjaerbye will be coming back with a 5-man roster where he'll be joined by fellow Danes Gade, AZ, Borup, and Fessor for a squad that is currently seeking an organization to compete in online European Counter-Strike. And finally, we have a rumor as to the completion of the OG esports roster. We spoke last week about how they took the long-awaited decision to bench Issa, and they added Danish player Nico as a full-time member of the roster after he was standing in for the squad. Well, Polish website Weslo reports that Polish player Michu is touted to be the final addition to this roster. And if that is to be the case, I'm not exactly sure how confident I am in the new look of OG esports. When you bench a player like NBK, you're losing arguably the most talented supportive player in all of CSGO. He's going to have a level of experience, some knowledge in mid-round calling, and a cool head in high-pressure situations that is going to be very difficult to replace. And while Michu isn't exactly a rookie stepping into this OG roster, he's not the kind of high-valued, tenured Tier 1 player you'd be looking for to replace someone with the name value of NBK. And now when I take a look at the OG esports roster, while I believe that Alexi B could be a Tier 1 IGL, I don't necessarily feel that he has the requisite parts in what would be Mantu, Michu, the Danish, Nico, and Volde to try and find Tier 1 success in the CSGO esports space, which I think is a shame given OG's reputation, their TI winning reputation in Dota 2. I personally would have been expecting them to pursue some higher tier players and be pursuing ultimately silverware in the sport of CSGO. Well, that just about wraps things up for this week, ladies and gentlemen. Huge bombshell with the Cloud9 news, and I advise everybody watching this video to keep an eye on Evil Geniuses and their business moves over the next few months, because if they leave CSGO, the esports future will not be as bright as it was looking otherwise. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, guys. I, of course, have been Protalis, and you can check me out on Twitter and Twitch in the social media links at the bottom of this video. Leave a comment to let me know your thoughts on some of the news this week, and I'll catch you all next week for your next episode of the CSGO Update.